A humble nurse took care of a millionaire in a coma, changing his diapers without knowing who he really was. When he woke up and uttered his first words, what he said left her stunned. The clock struck 6 in the morning, when the city was still waking up under a veil of darkness. The streets, covered by a faint layer of dew, were scarcely traveled, and the cool air announced the start of a new day. On one of the main avenues, a sleek black car moved forward with caution. The driver, Richard Santamaria, kept his eyes fixed on the road, oblivious to any distraction. Everyone in the company knew him as an influential tycoon, someone rarely seen without a retinue of people around him. However, that morning, Richard had decided to drive alone, perhaps to clear his thoughts about the imminent board meeting he was about to face. Just as the sun began to peek out behind the buildings, the unthinkable happened. A thunderous explosion shattered the neighborhood's tranquility. Richard's vehicle, suddenly engulfed in flames, came to a halt in the middle of the avenue, causing panic among the few pedestrians out at that hour. Several people ran to help while frantically calling emergency services. The scene was chaotic. Dense smoke billowing from the twisted remains of the car, shattered glass everywhere, and a deafening silence that contrasted with the previous roar. Paramedics arrived at the scene a few minutes later, responding to the urgent calls from witnesses. Quickly, they pulled Richard out of the wreckage and placed him in the ambulance. His body showed superficial burns and significant bruises, but the most alarming initial diagnosis was a severe cranial trauma. His pulse was weak, and he struggled to breathe. Given the severity of his injuries, the medical team rushed him to the nearest clinic, a private institution known for its top-tier procedures. Meanwhile, in a middle-class neighborhood on the other side of the city, John Johnson was getting up to begin his daily routine. He was a humble nurse, respected in the hospital for his dedication and the kind way he treated patients. Unlike most of his colleagues, who often rotated shifts regularly, John worked extra hours whenever possible. The main reason was Mrs. Rose, his mother, an elderly woman who suffered from chronic pulmonary issues and required increasingly expensive treatments. John hurriedly prepared breakfast for his 8-year-old daughter, Lucia, while asking if she had everything ready for school. Lucia looked at him with sleepy but sweet eyes, trying to hide how much she wanted more time with him. She knew her father couldn't afford great luxuries, but she admired the devotion with which he cared for her and how hard he worked to support both her and her grandmother. "Dad, can you come to my dance performance at school today?" Lucia asked with hope. "I'll try, honey, but I have an extra shift at the hospital," John replied apologetically. From her room, Mrs. Rose, coughing lightly, watched the scene with a certain heaviness in her heart. Despite her pains and breathing difficulties, she wanted to keep the household peaceful. She knew the financial burden on John's shoulders and, in some way, blamed herself for not being able to contribute more. With a gentle smile, she wished her son and granddaughter well before they both headed out to start their day. Around the same time, almost simultaneously with the explosion of Richard's car, phones began to ring in different parts of the city. Sophia Lemus, Richard's personal attorney, was one of the first to learn about the accident. She was reviewing some documents in her office when she got the call from the clinic. Concern instantly showed on her face. She jumped up, grabbed some papers, and hurried to the hospital. Elsewhere, Henry Clinton, Richard's partner in several strategic ventures, received the news while meeting with potential investors. He concealed his surprise and abruptly ended the session, citing personal issues. His expression turned serious and distant. As a man accustomed to dealing with big numbers and risky deals, he rarely showed his emotions. However, this unexpected call seemed to affect him more than usual. On another side of the city, Maria Fernanda, head of public relations for Richard's company, also felt the impact of the news. She began issuing cautious messages to the media, asking for respect given her boss's delicate condition. Though Maria Fernanda was known for her composure and skill in handling media crises, this time a chill ran down her spine. Deep inside, she sensed that something bigger was emerging behind that explosion, something that could reshape the corporate power structure. At the hospital, the staff doubled their efforts with the newly admitted patient. He was rushed to the ICU as his condition was critical. Several doctors worked to stabilize his vital signs, but their main concern was the potential brain damage he might have suffered. Amid the staff's commotion, some recognized the name Richard Santamaria and immediately realized he was one of the country's most influential men. Around that same hour, John Johnson finished his first shift and prepared for his extra hours. He went to the nurses' station to see which patients needed specialized care. Sitting at a computer, he reviewed the most recent admissions. Seeing a name he didn't recognize, he assumed it was just another patient. Indeed, he read Richard Santamaria without imagining it was the powerful businessman featured on newscasts and financial magazine covers. To him, every patient deserved equal care. Gossip soon filled the hospital halls. People said Santamaria's accident hadn't been accidental. Some spoke of a deliberate explosion, while others stuck to the official story that it was a mechanical malfunction. No one knew for sure what had happened, and amid the speculations, a few people started to wonder if there were hidden interests benefiting from Richard's prolonged absence at the helm of his businesses. When Sophia Lemus arrived, visibly worried, it reinforced the idea that the situation could become complicated. She tried talking to the attending physicians for details on Richard's diagnosis, but only received general answers: multiple traumas, minor burns, and a medically induced coma to protect his brain from swelling. No one could say how long it would take for him to wake up, or what lasting effects he might suffer. Henry Clinton, for his part, kept his distance during the immediate aftermath. He made a few calls from his office but did not show up at the hospital until much later. Many employees who worked with him recalled seeing him concerned, though there was a hint of calculation in his eyes. While Henry and Richard were partners, rumors circulated about disagreements in board decisions. Meanwhile, Maria Fernanda focused on developing a crisis management strategy. She instructed several spokespeople to downplay the incident's severity, though the force of the explosion left no room to doubt just how serious it was. She kept statements to a minimum and simply confirmed that Mr. Santamaria was receiving the best possible treatment. That very day, when John Johnson checked the assignment schedule, he was surprised to see he had been designated as the primary nurse in the ICU for this new coma patient. His duties entailed constant monitoring of vital signs, replacing IV lines and catheters, and of course the basic care required by incapacitated patients, like changing diapers and overseeing medication dosages. Although John cared little about patients' identities, several colleagues warned him to be cautious since this was a big fish, and any mistake could be extremely costly. Unmoved by such concerns, John stayed true to his professional ethics. To him, Richard Santamaria was simply a man in need of care. As the day wore on, tension rose. The faces of doctors and nurses reflected how important this case was. John noticed that the supervisors were more anxious than usual, as if someone were watching everything closely. Nevertheless, his priorities remained his mother's health and Lucia's well-being, so he paid little attention to rumors of conspiracy or corporate power struggles. During the final hour of his shift, John entered the intensive care room. He observed Richard Santamaria hooked up to various machines that kept his vital signs stable. On the monitor, he noticed a slightly irregular heartbeat that remained steady thanks to medical intervention. Carefully and professionally, he checked the patient's temperature, adjusted the IV line, and made sure the burn dressings were in good condition. Then, with the same dedication he gave all his patients, he changed Richard's diaper, never imagining the influence this man wielded in the outside world. The day ended under a cloud of mystery in the clinic's corridors. In hushed tones, employees wondered whether Richard's incident had really been an accident or whether someone had orchestrated the attack. According to rumors, the police would eventually come by to ask questions, but they hadn't arrived yet. For now, everyone could only hope Richard would recover or at least reach a stable condition. Thus ended the day in which John Johnson, a humble nurse burdened by family responsibilities, became involved in the life of a multimillionaire in a coma. Nothing in his demeanor hinted that he suspected the magnitude of the situation. To him, the top priority was his mother, his daughter, and his honest work. Never would he have imagined that this explosion would mark a turning point in his life and in Richard Santamaria's. By the end of his shift, John submitted his nursing report, bade his colleagues goodbye, and left the hospital, hoping to get home in time to see Lucia before she fell asleep. Meanwhile, in the ICU, Richard lay unconscious, surrounded by monitors beeping at regular intervals. Outside, night fell over the city, and no one could predict the extent of what was soon to become a deep web of intrigue. Unbeknownst to him, John had already been entrusted with caring for this enigmatic patient, someone whose true identity and far-reaching power placed him at the heart of a dangerous plot. That assignment would mark the beginning of a chain of events that would test not only John's ethics and resilience, but also the stability of a multi-million-dollar company and the lives of those caught in the magnate's orbit. The shadow of suspicion hovered over Richard's accident, and the gears of conspiracy were set in motion without him being able to stop them. That first day concluded in such a way, leaving John completely unaware of the magnitude of the person he was tending to. The explosion, the hospital transfer, and Richard Santamaria's mysterious condition were merely the beginning of a path riddled with questions. Neither the doctors nor the visitors could fully fathom what lay ahead in the coming hours, much less the humble nurse who, without intending to, would become the guardian angel of a man teetering on the brink. The morning after Richard Santamaria's car incident unfolded with unusual bustle at the clinic. The tycoon's name was now on everyone's lips in the hallways, and curiosity about his condition mingled with theories about the explosion's possible cause. Meanwhile, John Johnson, still unaware of the true magnitude of the coma patient under his care, continued his daily routine, trying to balance his demanding job and the tough family situation he was facing. Early on, John had risen to check on Mrs. Rose's medication before she even opened her eyes. The persistent cough and chronic fatigue she experienced had become part of their daily life. Mrs. Rose's pulmonary disease progressed slowly yet steadily, requiring costly treatment not fully covered by insurance. John spent a large portion of his salary on the medications and equipment his mother needed to breathe better, something that pushed him to take on all the extra shifts he could. That morning, while heating some water for the infusion that soothed his mother's cough, John heard Lucia's voice calling him from the adjacent room. His 8-year-old daughter was getting ready for school, still holding on to the hope of spending more time with him. "Dad, can you help me with my backpack?" the girl asked, in a tone that was both affectionate and urgent. "I'm on my way, sweetie," John replied, setting the kettle aside to go help her. Lucia was wearing her school uniform, and her expression reflected both the typical joy of childhood and a budding concern. She knew her father often worked double shifts at the hospital, meaning she wouldn't see him until nighttime. Even so, she tried to mask it with a smile every time he was near. "Are you working late again?" she ventured to ask cautiously. "I'm afraid so, Lucia," John answered, carefully fastening the straps of her backpack. "Today they assigned me to the intensive care unit. I hope I can make it home before you fall asleep, but I can't promise." From her bed, Mrs. Rose heard the conversation and sighed with melancholy. Each time she saw her son wearing himself out to support the family, she felt a knot form in her throat. She wanted John to be happy, to have time to enjoy his daughter, but their financial hardships gave them no respite. So, when they were briefly alone, she gently suggested that he not overwork himself. "Son, I don't want you neglecting Lucia on my account," she said, stroking his hand. "I know things aren't easy, but don't push yourself so hard." "Mom, as long as I can keep working, I'll do what's necessary. Your health comes above everything," John answered with determination. Soon after, John left home to drop Lucia off at school and then made his way to the hospital. On the way, he noticed the billboards featuring Richard Santamaria's face, advertising real estate developments and charity campaigns. He glanced sideways at the golden letters of the last name, Santa Maria, thinking how ironic it was that a comatose magnate was under his care, without him having yet connected the dots between his patient's name and the omnipresent face across the city. Once at the clinic, a heavy atmosphere hung in the air. Doctors, nurses, and administrators hurried past with worried expressions. Dr. Alvaro Rivas, the hospital supervisor, had arrived. He was typically neutral and pragmatic, but that morning his demeanor was different. He greeted the executives who came asking about Richard with a certain wariness. Among them was Sophia, the attorney, who was demanding immediate access to the medical information. Aware that the hospital had significant contracts with Santa Maria's company, Dr. Rivas tried to maintain a professional stance, though he internally felt the pressure not to jeopardize that financial relationship. He was concerned that any error or delay in Richard's treatment might lead to backlash against the administration. Nevertheless, he explained to Sophia that, to protect patient privacy, he could only share essential medical reports. "Please understand, Ms. Lemus," Rivas remarked with a slight stiffness. "Our priority is Mr. Santamaria's health. Without his authorization or a court order, we can't give you full access to his medical file." "Doctor, I understand your position, but I need to ensure Richard gets the best care possible. We've been working together for years, and I know exactly what's at stake," Sophia replied, trying to sound conciliatory. Meanwhile, John was in the nursing area, preparing to start his ICU shift. He heard comments about the attorney's arrival and learned that she was insisting on seeing Richard immediately. However, this changed nothing for him. His duty was to ensure the patient's comfort and stability, regardless of how much power that person held outside the hospital. Between checkups and routine care, John briefly crossed paths with Sophia in the hallway. She rushed by, flipping through papers and talking on the phone. Seeing how focused she was, he wondered if she might be related to the patient, since she seemed more personally concerned than just professionally invested. While John attended to Richard, confirming vital signs and adjusting a few bandages, he couldn't help but notice the stark contrast of their circumstances. Richard's condition required expensive equipment and procedures, all covered by his private insurance and ultimately by his fortune. Meanwhile, John had to watch every penny he spent on his mother's inhalers. Even the hospital where he worked benefited from subsidies and support that Santa Maria's company provided in exchange for prestige and other corporate advantages. In that moment, John remembered that Lucia had mentioned a school trip that cost more than usual. He felt a little stab of worry at the thought of setting aside money to pay for the outing. He didn't want to deprive her of something as simple as a trip with her classmates, but he couldn't ignore that Mrs. Rose's health took precedence. Sophia, for her part, kept trying to contact various people at the company to update them on any progress. According to rumors, Henry Clinton, Richard's partner, was avoiding going to the hospital and preferred to handle matters from the company's main office, steering clear of public appearances. Maria Fernanda, the PR director, continued to project an official stance of calm to the media, although more and more voices questioned whether the explosion in Richard's car had truly been accidental or a deliberate act. Dr. Rivas called an urgent meeting with the medical staff most closely involved in Richard's case. As the primary nurse assigned to him, John was required to attend. There, the supervisor emphasized how crucial it was to avoid unnecessary information leaks. He also mentioned that any mistake could be extremely costly for the hospital's reputation. John listened quietly, realizing there was more at stake than just a patient's recovery. Rivas's anxious tone betrayed the underlying economic and political pressures in which John was not directly implicated, at least not yet. When the meeting ended, John returned to his routine of checking on Richard. He carefully examined the bandages on the burns and monitored the ventilator. In the dim light of the ICU, Richard remained motionless, eyes closed, as though refusing to wake to a world now riddled with intrigue and suspicion about his own accident. John couldn't help but feel compassion for this man, who, despite his wealth, now lay defenseless. Meanwhile, John's personal life showed no sign of slowing down. By the time he left the hospital, Night had fallen, and he felt the weight of extra hours on his shoulders. Still, he hurried home in hopes of arriving early enough. He entered silently, hoping Lucia might still be awake. But he found her curled up on the sofa, clutching a storybook with tired eyes. Her face lit up upon seeing her father, but fatigue got the better of her, and she quickly drifted off to sleep. John gently carried her to her room, tucked her in, and kissed her forehead. Then he went to check on Mrs. Rose, who also appeared to have drifted off after another round of breathing treatments. The nurse sighed, wondering how long he could maintain such a relentless pace. However, he had no idea how closely his future was entwined with Richard Santamaria's. For the moment, he only sensed that tensions were rising at the hospital and that the constant phone calls from executives and lawyers to his supervisor did not bode well. If he had known that the situation would affect not just the magnate's company, but also his own family's stability, he might have tried to keep his distance. But it was already too late. Destiny had taken hold, intertwining John's life with Richard's without warning. In the days to come, the disparities between their worlds would become even more evident. While one struggled to pay for a single medication, the other spent vast sums on high-level projects. Nevertheless, despite such differences, illness united them both in the same space. The ICU, a place where money and social status lose their power compared to the need to survive. Over at Santamaria's company, an unusual tension arose after Richard's hospitalization. Although news of the accident and the severity of his condition had initially shocked employees, it didn't take long for speculation about the real motives behind the explosion to surface. No one was sure if Richard Santamaria would ever return to his seat on the board, and the prolonged silence from his partner, Henry Clinton, did nothing to calm anyone's doubts. During the first few days after the incident, Henry kept a tight lid on information. Even though several departments needed his approval or input, he postponed meetings and cancelled appointments, giving vague excuses. Yet that apparent inaction clashed with the quiet buzz emerging from Maria Fernanda's office. The PR director was said to be receiving constant calls from investors and organizing private meetings outside the company's usual facilities. It was precisely in one of these clandestine gatherings that the plot began to take shape. Henry Clinton and Maria Fernanda invited a select group of foreign investors to a luxurious boardroom in the city's financial district. The location, different from Santamaria's headquarters, afforded them a measure of discretion. After a brief welcome, Henry presented ambitious expansion plans that seemed overly bold for a company whose founder had suddenly been incapacitated. "We trust our projections will be met," Henry said, adopting an air of false confidence. "Richard Santamaria laid the groundwork, but it's likely he won't be able to resume his duties in the near future. This situation opens up a range of opportunities for us." "Am I to assume his absence will be longer than the official statements suggest?" one of the investors asked, cautiously yet with interest. "I'd rather not speculate," Maria Fernanda chimed in with a courteous smile. "However, given how serious the accident was, it would be prudent to prepare for a corporate structure that does not rely on his swift recovery." Those present exchanged complicit glances. The matter wasn't just about Richard's health, it was also about the chance to close riskier deals that, with Santamaria at the helm, might have been impossible or would have required a lengthy evaluation process. Henry and Maria Fernanda were practically salivating at the prospect of extraordinary gains, promising investors open doors in diverse sectors, from real estate to infrastructure ventures. It seemed clear they aimed to consolidate their power on the board before anyone could contest their maneuvers. Meanwhile, at the company's main offices, confusion was taking root. The finance, legal, and operations departments needed a figure of authority to provide reassurance. That was when Sophia Lemus, Richard's attorney and advisor, felt compelled to step in. Sophia's office was close to Richard's and gave her access to most of the confidential information. Known for her impeccable professionalism, she was well suited to take on a more active role. However, she lacked any formal mandate that would place her above Henry or Maria Fernanda. Sophia began noticing disturbing signs: frozen tenders without explanation, deals that Richard had championed put on hold, and above all, whispers of new strategic alliances that didn't go through the usual channels. As she combed through files, she found discrepancies in budgets and missing funds. Though she lacked concrete evidence, she suspected someone was trying to move large sums of money without the scrutiny that Richard normally applied. Determined to halt any hostile takeover, Sophia spoke with several members of the board. She explained that if Richard remained in a coma, it was crucial not only to safeguard his recovery, but also to ensure no one undermined his legal position as head of the company. Yet she met resistance from certain directors who seemed more interested in looking the other way than in opposing Henry. Many had financial ties to him or personal projects that depended on Clinton's goodwill. By the day, tensions grew. It wasn't just Richard's absence that created fractures in the corporate structure, but also the lack of transparent information. Employees began whispering that some bosses would benefit if the president never returned. Rumors ran rampant. One claimed Henry had taken over a major client account without authorization. Another swore they had seen Maria Fernanda striking deals with a European investment fund, demanding far higher returns than the market average. Increasingly alarmed, Sophia sought ways to impose order. She painstakingly reviewed Richard's existing powers of attorney and the company's bylaws. According to the statutes, if the president was permanently incapacitated or, after a certain period, showed no sign of being fit to lead, the board could declare him unfit and appoint an interim replacement. The window for declaring such incapacity was not very long, and Henry, backed by Maria Fernanda, seemed eager to let the clock run out. During this tense time, a handful of employees loyal to Richard approached Sophia with their worries. They revealed that Henry and Maria Fernanda had been recruiting trusted allies in critical areas like finance and international relations. Santa Maria's longtime team, those who had witnessed his rise from scratch, felt sidelined, fearing for their jobs. This only confirmed that a large-scale internal coup was in the works. All the while, Sophia could not forget the human factor of the situation. Though she was set on protecting Richard's legal interests, she genuinely worried about his health. Over and over she told herself she needed to visit him at the hospital to check on his condition and, above all, to see if there was any sign of improvement. If Richard woke up, his statements could completely alter the internal dynamics of the company. As the days passed, the conspiracy became clearer. Henry's late-night calls to certain foreign contacts, the odd transactions in the accounting department, and the new contracts with extremely short deadlines all formed the pieces of a troubling puzzle. Sophia's internal alarm bells rang when a staff member told her, in confidence, that the company was about to sign agreements to sell off strategic assets, without seeking the president's approval, a step that had always been non-negotiable under his leadership. To further complicate matters, Maria Fernanda intensified her PR efforts, giving ambiguous public updates about Richard's condition. She spoke of a slow but positive recovery, while hinting to investors and upper management that the president could be out of commission for months if he ever came out of the coma at all. This two-pronged narrative left employees confused and fed the speculation about Richard's true fate. Finally, Sophia decided it was time to act decisively. She requested temporary leave from the office for a couple of hours and, without telling anyone her plans, headed to the hospital where Richard was still hospitalized. A knot formed in her stomach, unsure of what she might find there. On one hand, she hoped to see signs of recovery that might help her counter Henry and Maria Fernanda's momentum. On the other, she feared confirming that Richard was nowhere close to waking up, which would only strengthen the offensive launched by his adversaries on the board. Upon arriving at the clinic's reception desk, she identified herself by her full name and indicated that she was the patient's legal representative. The staff, recognizing her from previous visits, let her through without any trouble. She took the elevator with a heavy heart, mentally rehearsing a list of questions she wanted to ask Richard's medical team. She needed to know how long he was expected to remain in a coma, whether there had been any neurological responses, and if there was any chance he would speak in the near future. Stepping out on the ICU floor, she heard the typical hush in that wing, broken only by the intermittent beeping of machines and monitors. Sophia approached the nurses' station and asked about patient Santa Maria. In a kindly tone, a nurse told her she had to speak with the supervising doctor first for any updated information, but he did allow her to stand at the doorway of Richard's room. From that distance, Sophia watched through the glass as a group of doctors and nursing staff carefully handled wires and checked the monitors. Richard remained motionless, eyes closed, his face still showing faint burn marks. The image stood in stark contrast to her memory of him, a man who radiated energy and rarely let anything slip from his control. She sighed sadly, anxiety knotting her chest. Echoing in her mind were phrases she'd heard at the company. Richard won't be back soon. The company can't wait. There are deals that must be closed right now. She sensed these weren't just assessments of her boss's health, but pretexts to accelerate drastic changes in the corporate structure. Closing her eyes for a moment, Sophia tried to calm the torrent of thoughts overwhelming her. She needed to be strong and clear-headed for what lay ahead. She had to protect Richard and the company he had built through sheer effort. The attorney understood that if no one did anything soon, when Richard finally woke up, he might find that everything he had created was in the hands of people who had betrayed him. With this mixture of resolve and unease, Sophia took her first step toward the intensive care room, ready to request an updated medical report. There, amid the background chorus of beeping machines, she fully realized how taut the strings of treachery had become. A silent battle was brewing, one that could redefine the fate not only of Santa Maria's enterprise, but of everyone who orbited around Richard and his ventures. Inspector Benitez held the preliminary report on Richard Santamaria's accident in his hands. It was a thin folder, full of blurry photos and muddled statements, far from the solid kind of document one would expect for a case of this magnitude. From the first day he took on the investigation, something had struck him as odd, particularly how quickly the authorities had ruled it a mechanical failure as the official cause, shutting down other possibilities. During a morning meeting at the precinct, his superiors confronted him with the usual "we need quick results" speech. It wasn't his first time hearing this, but he was more troubled than usual by the subtext. An attack on someone as influential as Richard Santamaria demanded a careful, thorough investigation. Yet there was an unusual push to wrap things up, as though someone wanted a scapegoat found and the matter closed. "Benitez, we've spent too much time on this," his chief said, sounding tired. "The hospital keeps giving the same report. Mr. Santamaria is in a coma, no signs of improvement. The press wants answers, investors too. We need this investigation shut down." "But, Commander, the initial witness statement suggested a deliberate explosion. Why has everyone suddenly changed their story?" Benitez asked, clenching his fists in frustration. "Maybe people got scared, or they decided it was an accident after all. We can't keep sinking resources into this forever. Find a mechanical failure or a culprit and close the case," his superior cut in impatiently. The inspector pressed his lips together, holding back his indignation. He had a hunch that something big was hidden behind these supposed coincidences. A powerful man like Richard was hardly immune to enemies or internal conflicts, especially in the business world, but he needed evidence to support his suspicions. With determined steps, he left the office, resolved to dig into every corner until he discovered the truth. Throughout that week, Benitez scheduled interviews with eyewitnesses who initially claimed to have seen a spark or a flash before the car exploded. However, each one had suspiciously changed their account. Those who first said the car blew up unexpectedly now claimed they weren't sure, that maybe they'd only heard a noise, or that they'd been too far away to really see what happened. Additionally, some witnesses had abruptly hired lawyers or refused to speak without legal counsel, atypical behavior for an ordinary bystander to a street accident. The more he dug, the more inconsistencies emerged. In the neighborhood's security records, several cameras seemed to have malfunctioned right before the incident, missing any crucial footage. Furthermore, forensic evidence on the vehicle was oddly labeled inconclusive by an outside expert who conveniently did contract work with multiple insurance companies linked to Richard's firm. A complex puzzle formed in Benitez's mind, each piece suggesting a deliberate act, even though, on paper, it remained an unfortunate incident. One day, as he pored over medical reports at the clinic's reception desk, he overheard the name Sophia Lemus. She had arrived with a determined stride, set on checking Richard's condition and speaking to his attending team. Spotting the inspector, she wore a curious expression. She knew the police were looking into the case, but she hadn't imagined someone like Benitez, serious-looking and calm, would be so committed to unraveling the truth. "Excuse me, are you Inspector Benitez?" Sophia asked, offering a slight smile. "That's correct. We're investigating Mr. Santamaria's explosion," the officer replied, not taking his eyes off her. He was eager to hear the perspective of someone close to the victim. "I'm Sophia Lemus, his attorney and legal counsel. I've heard there are many questions about the cause of the accident. How's the investigation going?" she asked seriously. "It's been difficult," Benitez answered candidly. "Initially, a few witnesses seemed certain it was intentional, but overnight, they changed their stories. Everything points to someone pulling strings to wrap this up as a mechanical glitch." Sophia nodded slowly. Before coming to the hospital, she had reviewed certain company reports that supported the theory of a targeted attack. Yet she needed definitive evidence for it to hold up in court. "Inspector, I'm worried about what's happening at the company. Richard's partner, Henry Clinton, has gained tremendous power in the past few weeks, and Maria Fernanda, the PR director, seems to be covering up suspicious goings-on. I'm afraid they'll seize full control while Richard's incapacitated," Sophia said, lowering her voice and glancing around to ensure no one else was listening. "Do you have any concrete evidence?" asked Benitez, leaning forward with interest. "Nothing I can present yet, just rumors and incomplete documents, but there are signs they're planning something illicit or, at best, highly unethical." Benitez processed the information, struck by Sophia's directness despite lacking solid proof. He felt the frustration of being stuck in a no-win situation. The official investigation demanded irrefutable facts, yet time and political pressure were stacked against him. "I ask that you keep digging, Counselor," Benitez continued. "Any lead on who might have staged this attack would be crucial. I'll keep rechecking statements and trying to push for more interviews." "I will, but I warn you, if Henry or anyone on the board finds out I'm investigating, they could shut me out," Sophia said, her concern evident in her voice. "Then we'll have to be very careful," he replied, sensing the urgency of coordinating their efforts. After this brief yet revealing exchange, Benitez headed to his car, aware of the tension surrounding such a well-guarded secret. He knew witnesses don't just change their stories by chance, and that the Santa Maria enterprise had some very powerful interests at play. Higher-ups in the force wanted a quick scapegoat, but he refused to sacrifice his integrity for a rushed conclusion. He watched as the sunset painted the sky in deep colors and started the engine, promising himself he would keep investigating, even if it meant standing up to his superiors. The following day, he returned to the site of the explosion, hoping to find a missed clue. He combed the sidewalk, examining marks on the pavement and noting the distance between the security cameras. He noticed soot stains on a nearby wall, confirming the blast's strength. Yet nothing offered definitive proof that someone had set it off deliberately. Back at the station, the piles of reports on his desk only magnified his suspicion that bribes were involved. Several witnesses had received unusually large sums of money or had landed sudden jobs at satellite companies owned by the Santa Maria Corporation. Benitez managed to verify that, in certain cases, the funds had been transferred from accounts tied to Henry Clinton's close associates. But it was nearly impossible to stitch together a clear chain of responsibility without a direct witness or confession. Official statements, in the meantime, remained flimsy. The expert who examined the car claimed there was no evidence of an explosive device, but noted a mechanical failure of unknown origin. Each line of his report seemed crafted to sidestep confirming an attack. Benitez ground his teeth, frustrated by how the truth slipped through ambiguous paperwork. In a second conversation with Sophia, the inspector learned the board planned to declare Richard unfit if he showed no improvement within a set time frame. That could mean, by the time Santamaria emerged from his coma, if he ever did, he would find his own company in the hands of those who orchestrated his downfall. Sophia kept insisting they needed hard evidence to uproot the conspiracy. Still, as an attorney, she was constrained by the company's internal structure. More and more rumors reached her, but none that amounted to tangible proof. Telling this to Benitez only compounded his frustration. He wanted to act, to catch the guilty party, but realized the institution around him was pressuring him to drop the case and move on. One afternoon, returning to his office with a grim expression after a fruitless interrogation of a key witness, Benitez stared at the board he'd filled with names, dates, and arrows linking events. The case remained incomplete, as if someone had erased the vital pieces. He recalled his own promise. He wouldn't give up, even if he had to pursue the truth on his own. "I won't let this go unpunished," he muttered, locking the documents in a drawer. He could almost feel the breath of those who wanted a convenient culprit breathing down his neck, but he had no intention of yielding. The inspector left that night with the conviction that someone powerful was behind the attack. Sophia's warning about Henry and Maria Fernanda echoed in his mind, and the puzzle pieces seemed to point to a murky scenario of business interests. Though he had no clear path to the truth, he was determined to keep going, even if it meant clashing with forces that might threaten his own safety or career. With every passing day, Benitez felt the shadow of conspiracy spreading wider and darker. But he couldn't allow Richard Santamaria's explosion to be buried under sealed files. For now, his word and determination were his only shield against his superior's pressure and the hush money silencing witnesses. Thus ended his day, consumed by dismay, yet clinging to his unrelenting will to pursue an investigation so many wanted to halt at all costs. At the clinic, days went by at a dizzying pace, and John Johnson could barely catch his breath. Between his double shifts and the constant care required by Richard Santamaria, he felt the weight of exhaustion piling on. But his greatest worry wasn't in the ICU. It was in the small apartment he shared with his mother, Mrs. Rose, and his daughter, Lucia. Mrs. Rose's health had deteriorated drastically over the past few weeks. Her pulmonary disease led to more frequent, more intense respiratory crises. Each morning, John found her with labored breathing and a persistent wheeze every time she inhaled. She tried to hide her pain so as not to worry him further, but the anxious looks they exchanged said it all. It was clear her current treatment was no longer sufficient, and a more expensive procedure was urgently needed to stabilize her condition. The problem was, John had almost no resources left. Despite working extra shifts and saving every cent, the medical bills kept growing. He had even considered taking out a bank loan, but his salary as a nurse didn't qualify him for decent terms. Night after night, once his shifts ended, he'd stretch out on the couch, mentally reviewing every possible way to get the money. But each day, the options seemed to dwindle. Meanwhile, at the clinic, John carried on with his routine caring for Richard, checking vital signs, making sure medication doses were correct, and seeing to it that the burns on his skin were treated properly. Though he had grown used to the nearly unresponsive presence of this man, he still didn't fully grasp Richard's significance beyond those walls. Yes, he was aware he was a powerful magnate, but had no real details about his influence. For John, every patient deserved the same dedication, whether rich or poor. Even so, his curiosity and, above all, his desperation over his mother's health drove him to dig a little deeper into Santamaria's company. During one of his breaks in the hospital cafeteria, John asked a few colleagues if they knew anything about the corporation. One of the orderlies filled him in on the various business branches: construction, insurance, pharmaceuticals, among others. A nurse mentioned that Santamaria had once sponsored public health programs, though he was also rumored to face lawsuits on several fronts. That last remark made John even more curious. He knew the pharmaceutical industry tended to be turbulent, and it faintly reminded him of his father, who had passed away years before due to complications from a chronic illness. Back then, John's family had struggled to afford the medication he'd been prescribed, as there was a shortage in the region caused by a lawsuit between labs and distributors. His father ended up not receiving the proper treatment, triggering a crisis from which he never recovered. That night, John returned home feeling uneasy. After checking on Mrs. Rose's condition and making sure Lucia was asleep, he sat down at his old computer. He began searching for information about Richard Santamaria's company, scanning news articles and online forums about legal disputes related to drug distribution. As he dug into older stories, he came across a reference that made his heart sink. About 8 years prior, Santamaria's firm had been involved in litigation that blocked the import of certain medications regionally. The dispute centered on a group of partners who wanted to renegotiate import contracts. Although the disagreements were eventually resolved, the temporary blockade left hospitals and pharmacies without essential medicines. He then noticed that the dates of this legal fight coincided, chillingly precisely, with the period when his father's condition worsened and he ultimately passed away. John froze before his screen. A surge of anger and helplessness took hold of him. Could Richard Santamaria have been indirectly responsible for his father's death? Or had his company at least played a part in the shortage of vital medicines? The articles didn't pinpoint a clear culprit, as several corporations were implicated. Still, the name Santamaria stood out as one of the major forces in that dispute. With his heart pounding, he recalled the anguish his mother felt at not being able to find or afford the medication her husband needed. He remembered the sleepless nights, the despair of watching his father weaken beyond help. Now, the man lying in a coma under his care might well have been one of the driving forces behind that family tragedy. John felt a deep resentment growing in his chest, blending with the guilt of not having known anything at the time. The following morning, he returned to the hospital in a grim mood. Changing Richard's dressings and tending to his needs felt more difficult than usual. Each time he looked at him, John envisioned his own father's face and his mother's desperation. He wondered if Richard really deserved the devotion of a nurse who, years ago, had lost his father because of a business dispute, one that Santamaria's company had evidently initiated, or at least escalated. Even so, something more powerful asserted itself in John's conscience, his professional calling. He had sworn an oath to care for lives and protect every patient's well-being, regardless of who they were. While he felt rage and sadness at the possibility that Richard had been part of the system that brought so much pain upon his family, his nurse's ethics wouldn't let him discriminate. His job was to treat Richard with dignity and respect, just as he would any other person in the ICU. This internal conflict intensified with every minute spent at the magnate's bedside. John found himself wanting Richard to wake up so he could demand answers, as if the words of a man still hovering at the edge of consciousness might bring him comfort or justice. Yet he reminded himself that a direct confrontation wouldn't change the past or bring his father back. Meanwhile, Mrs. Rose's condition was getting worse. On a particularly trying day, John's mother suffered a respiratory crisis that nearly required hospitalization. The specialist recommended intensive pulmonary rehabilitation therapy, plus a new, very expensive medication. John realized he might have to dip into the savings meant for Lucia's education to cover his mother's treatment. He felt his life collapsing around him, unable to see any stable way to provide for both needs. Then came an unexpected twist. That same day, someone from the hospital's Human Resources Department mentioned to John that there was a special assistance fund available from the Santamaria Group for clinic employees facing extreme circumstances. At first, John clung to the idea that he wanted nothing from that company, not after learning about its potential part in his father's death. But reality was harsh. His mother urgently needed those medications, and his daughter needed a father who could be present and clear-headed, not consumed by financial desperation. His moral dilemma became even more painful. How could he accept help from the very organization that, based on his findings, might have contributed to his family's tragedy? Meanwhile, he kept changing Richard's diapers and monitoring his machines with impeccable dedication, though he felt a lump in his throat each time he was reminded of his father. Thus, John found himself torn by a piercing contradiction. On one side, his ethical duty demanded that he continue caring for Richard with utmost professionalism. On the other, the grief over losing his father to a corporate injustice, a conflict in which the Santa Maria firm played a role, gnawed at him. The comatose magnate's impassive face, oblivious to all the guilt and resentment piled around him, served as a stark reminder of the immense power gap and the apparent impunity with which big businessmen could toy with ordinary people's lives. At the end of that shift, before heading home, John had to sit for a while in the break room to steady his breathing and his thoughts. He didn't know whether he should investigate further, confront someone, or simply swallow his pain and accept aid from the same company that had once plunged his family into despair. He felt torn, trapped between his professional obligations and an old wound that refused to heal. Stepping out of the hospital, the night shrouded him in silence, and inside him echoed a lingering question. How do I care for a man who, perhaps unknowingly, caused my family so much harm? With a furrowed brow and a heavy heart, he headed home, all too aware that beyond his skills as a nurse, he now had his own demons to face. That day ended steeped in sorrow and confusion. John realized that his father's story and that of Richard Santamaria were intertwined in unimaginable ways, forcing him into a moral quandary that took his breath away. Financial need and his oath to protect lives clashed with the anger that had taken root in his heart. And while Mrs. Rose hovered between life and death, John braced himself for a dilemma, threatening to shake his deepest convictions. Night in the ICU passed with an eerie stillness. The hospital's corridors were nearly empty, and the beep of monitors set the unhurried tempo of the medical routine. After a long shift, John Johnson was alone in the main ward, reviewing nurses' notes and ensuring each patient remained stable. From time to time, he glanced toward Richard Santamaria's room, where the magnate still lay in a coma, reliant on a ventilator and the steady drip of medications that kept him alive. John's mind kept returning to his recent discovery, the possibility that Richard's firm had taken part in a legal dispute that kept his father from getting the medication he needed. That mixture of anger and moral uncertainty followed him with every step, even as he tried to honor his professional commitment wholeheartedly. Still, caring for Richard was growing more uncomfortable by the day. Suddenly, one of the monitors in Richard's room emitted a tone different from usual, shifting out of its regular rhythm. John hurried over and entered the cubicle where the patient lay. He saw that the oxygen level and heart rate were unsteady, as if something were changing in his body. Leaning in for a closer look, fearing a relapse or some kind of crisis, he suddenly noticed Richard's eyes flutter open, his body trembling slightly. For a moment, John thought it might just be a reflex, yet Richard's gaze locked onto him, showing a desperation that cut straight to John's core. As though wrestling with a great weight that kept him from speaking, the magnate forced his lips open and spoke in a rough whisper, uttering words John would never have expected from a man on death's doorstep. "This doesn't end here." John felt his heart jump. He rushed to check Richard's pulse and blood pressure, trying his best to stay calm. In a soft voice, he urged him not to strain himself, but in Richard's eyes, he saw equal parts anguish and resolve, as if that sentence were just the beginning of something far more momentous. The ICU reacted without delay. As soon as it was confirmed that Richard had opened his eyes and spoken, word spread like wildfire through the hospital's corridors. Dr. Rivas, the supervising doctor, arrived wearing a look that mixed disbelief with restrained excitement, checking his vitals and ordering immediate tests. Alerted by an urgent call from one of the physicians, Sophia showed up within minutes, anxious to assess her boss's and clients' true condition. Meanwhile, At Santa Maria's corporate offices, Henry Clinton and Maria Fernanda also got the news. The message was brief and forceful. Richard woke up. Neither showed relief. Instead, they exchanged worried glances. Until then, they'd grown more certain his coma would linger, allowing them to do as they pleased on the board of directors. His return, even if only partial, now threatened to upend their plans. They needed to find a way to neutralize this unexpected variable. "How could he have come around so quickly?" Henry growled, pacing the room. "The doctors never gave us any hope of a short-term recovery," Maria Fernanda added, scowling at her phone. "We'll have to make sure he doesn't speak, or at least that he can't incriminate us." While the pressure escalated among the conspirators, Sophia entered the ICU and found John standing beside Richard's bed, carefully making sure he didn't overexert himself. The patient still looked frail, his eyes half closed and breathing labored, but with a faint sign of awareness. "How is he? Has he said anything else?" Sophia asked, her voice tense with concern. "No, just that this doesn't end here," John replied, still shaken by the moment. "He seemed terrified, like he was afraid for his life." Sophia approached and gently took Richard's hand, trying to soothe him. He responded with a slight squeeze, showing he recognized her. However, just as he tried to speak again, a fit of dry coughing overtook him, cutting off any chance at conversation. The attending physician decided to administer a mild sedative, believing it was unwise to push the patient any further in his current state. By the early hours of the morning, after the initial commotion, the hospital quieted down again. Sophia remained in the waiting area to finalize urgent paperwork and speak with the doctors. John, meanwhile, clutched his nursing notes, mentally replaying the scene of Richard opening his eyes and speaking. A man like him wouldn't say such words by accident. John was sure he was referencing something dangerous, perhaps a looming threat, or the certainty that someone had wanted him dead. As Sophia came back to say goodbye, she looked at John with pleading eyes. "Please, John, let me know if Richard says anything else. Whatever happens here could be critical for the company and for his own safety." "Don't worry. I'll do my best," he answered somberly, aware that his connection to the magnate had just become even more delicate. From that point on, Richard seemed to improve slightly with each passing hour. He managed to open his eyes again after a while and hold a gaze for a few seconds. In whispers barely audible, he spoke words John struggled to interpret, phrases like "don't trust" and "be careful," plus names that faded before they became clear. Sometimes the name Henry emerged as a muted murmur, only fueling John's suspicion that something sinister lay behind the attempt on Richard's life. A closer bond soon formed between Richard and John. The weakened magnate appeared to cling to the presence of the nurse who had tirelessly cared for him from day one. On the rare occasions when he managed a coherent sentence, Richard searched out John's eyes, sharing fragments of a truth he urgently needed to reveal. "John," Richard would mumble in one of those moments, "they want—" "Easy, Mr. Santamaria. You need to rest," the nurse whispered, trying to calm him. "No. Trust in—" Richard would try to finish, in vain, his voice trailing off into shallow gasps. Richard's growing dependence on John sparked talk among the hospital staff. It was unusual for a magnate of such stature to put his trust in a humble nurse, instead of calling on his closest associates. But, given the circumstances and Richard's vulnerable state, he seemed wary of nearly everyone except the man who had stood by him, changing his bandages and monitoring his vitals. Naturally, word of his awakening did not go unnoticed by Henry and Maria Fernanda. Alarmed by this turn of events, they began strategizing how to keep Richard from talking, or at least ensure he couldn't point fingers at those responsible for the accident. Whispers circulated that someone had offered large sums to medical personnel to restrict access to the ICU or administer drugs to keep Richard sedated, supposedly to protect his health. Tension surrounding the Santa Maria company mounted, and the intrigue in the hospital corridors grew right alongside it. While all this scheming took place behind the scenes, John found himself increasingly entangled. In addition to needing to support Mrs. Rose and Lucia, and grappling with the painful revelation that Santa Maria's company might have played a role in his father's death, he now also had to deal with the almost desperate trust Richard was placing in him. Deep down, John was still waging an inner battle with the conflicting emotions it all stirred up. How could he care for a man linked to so much suffering while also tending to his pleas for protection? The answer to that question began to emerge one night during his shift, when Richard, still weak and speaking in a quavering voice, took John's hand and whispered a few words that left him stunned. Although he could neither utter complete names nor give detailed explanations, his hints were enough for John to realize that someone was plotting to strip Richard of control over his company, and also that the explosion might not have been an accident. "I need your help," Richard managed to say between ragged breaths. "This goes beyond." Each word echoed in John's mind, heightening his sense of vertigo. On the one hand, he felt morally obligated to notify Sophia and Inspector Benitez, who remained committed to uncovering the truth behind the attack. On the other hand, he knew that every step he took would drag him further into a danger he didn't fully understand. Still, Richard's desperate look and John's own haunted memories pushed him to realize he could no longer stay on the sidelines. News that Richard Santamaria had regained consciousness spread like wildfire both inside and outside the hospital. No one could deny that his awakening changed the pieces on the chessboard, especially for those who wanted him sidelined. While some saw it as a beacon of hope, others perceived it as an imminent threat. The long silence surrounding Richard was crumbling, and with it the future of the company and all those involved in the conspiracy hung in the balance. That same day, Dr. Alvaro Rivas, the hospital's supervising physician, received an alarming banking alert on his phone. It showed a deposit of several $1,000s, leaving him speechless. Never before had he seen such a large sum appear in his personal account overnight. He immediately reviewed the transactions and confirmed that there was no clear sender. His first reaction was disbelief, followed by a profound anxiety. Who stood to benefit from bribing him? A few hours later, an anonymous envelope arrived at his office. Inside, he found a brief, to-the-point note. "If it's not possible to induce another coma, at least delay the patient's recovery." The message was crystal clear. The people behind this money wanted to hinder Richard's improvement. The doctor recognized it was an illegal move, but fear consumed him. He was now faced with the possibility of losing his career or even risking his own safety if he disobeyed. After years of hard work and sacrifice to reach his current position, panic set in. With trembling hands, Rivas locked himself in his office to figure out how to partially fulfill those demands without utterly compromising the patient's well-being. After all, he was a doctor, and his calling compelled him to save lives. So he chose to subtly tamper with Richard's medication, adjusting doses just enough so that, without killing him, it would slow down his recovery. This strategy, he thought, would buy him time to figure out who was behind it all and hopefully find a way out of the blackmail unscathed. Meanwhile, at Santa Maria's corporate headquarters, the friction between Sophia Lemus and Maria Fernanda reached a critical point. Ever since Richard had woken up, however weak he remained, Sophia had been seeking ways to protect his interests and stop any attempt to manipulate the board. But Maria Fernanda, acting on her own plans, or perhaps in league with Henry Clinton, decided to use confidential information she had gathered about the attorney's past. One afternoon, Maria Fernanda cornered Sophia in the hallway of the main office. Wearing what appeared to be a pleasant smile, she motioned for her to step away from the other employees. "We need to talk," she said quietly, meeting Sophia's gaze with a chilly stare. "What about?" Sophia asked, her expression taut. "Your background, dear," Maria Fernanda replied, handing her a folder. "I have documents that show certain inconsistencies from your time at that old law firm. I bet you don't want this coming to light." Sophia took the folder with trembling hands and opened it to examine its contents. Immediately she recognized details of a prior case in which, due to a legal technicality, she had accepted a borderline strategy to benefit a client of questionable repute. Although she hadn't committed any crime, she had put herself in a position that might raise ethical doubts and could tarnish her professional standing today. "What do you want from me?" she blurted out, glaring at Maria Fernanda with a mix of anger and worry. "It's simple. I need your cooperation," the PR director said with a shrug. "You must back the claim that Richard mismanaged company funds and engaged in questionable financial practices. With your testimony, we can push an internal motion to formally oust him." "That's a lie. You have no evidence of any alleged wrongdoing," Sophia shot back defiantly, though her voice shook a little. "Well, you could be that evidence if you support our findings," Maria Fernanda retorted, raising her chin haughtily. "In return, no one will ever hear about your little slip-ups from the past." Sophia took a step back, trembling with anger, as she realized she was being shoved into betraying everything she believed in. She knew that in her line of work, reputation was everything. One blot on her record could destroy her career. But she also understood that if she cooperated in this charade, she would essentially push Richard into a legal abyss, handing full control of the company to Henry and Maria Fernanda. "You don't have to decide right now," Maria Fernanda added in a low voice. "Think it over carefully. We can make your life very easy or very difficult. It's your choice." With those words, she turned and left, leaving Sophia standing there alone with the folder in hand and a growing sense of nausea. She felt trapped. For years, she had been Richard's right-hand woman, yet she had little solid proof of the conspiracies that Henry and Maria Fernanda were cooking up. Now, with Richard still weak in a hospital bed, the company itself hung by a thread. The attorney had to decide whether she would risk her own reputation to protect her boss or cave to blackmail for the sake of her own future. Away from the executive suites, John Johnson was dealing with an equally grim situation. Ever since Richard had regained consciousness, John had felt himself drawn deeper into affairs far beyond his duties as a nurse. The magnate seemed to trust him in an unusual way, hinting at pieces of the conspiracy closing in around him. Without intending to, that made John a key figure in keeping Richard safe, or at least in passing crucial information on to Sophia. But his closeness with Richard began to bring trouble to John's doorstep. One afternoon, after returning from an exhausting shift, he found a letter with no return address slipped under his door. Inside was simply a newspaper clipping showing Richard's photo, and in red letters, a message: "Stay out of things that don't concern you." It might not have been quite so chilling if not for the final lines: "Let things run their course if you don't want to regret it." The threat was unmistakable, and John felt a cold shiver down his spine. He thought of his mother, Mrs. Rose, whose health hung by a thread, and of his daughter Lucia, who relied on him for everything. What if these warnings escalated into actual violence, or worse? That night, he barely slept, preoccupied with his family's safety. The following days brought a tenser atmosphere. At the hospital, Dr. Rivas, racked with guilt, started behaving oddly. The sedative doses for Richard increased at specific times, though there was no medical reason to justify it. Sophia noticed the doctor's evasive attitude and, putting the pieces together, began to suspect that someone was pressuring him to keep Richard weak or even unconscious. However, she lacked the evidence to call him out. Meanwhile, Henry sat comfortably in his office armchair, rubbing his hands at the future that awaited him if he could consolidate control of the company. Maria Fernanda, at his side, coordinated calls with international partners, promising they would soon have free rein for projects that Richard had previously blocked. Both felt increasingly confident they would succeed, all the while keeping a watchful eye on reports about the magnate's condition. Sophia, engulfed by uncertainty, continued to resist Maria Fernanda's blackmail, but realized that each passing minute could prove fatal for Richard. She was torn between making a public stand in the company to expose what was happening or turning to the authorities. Yet Inspector Benitez, though still committed to his investigation, lacked solid evidence linking Richard's accident to a clear culprit. And if Sophia dared reveal her own leads, exposure of her past might leave her in an extremely vulnerable position. John, on his end, doubled his precautions at home. He checked the doors and windows twice, asking Lucia not to speak to strangers. The stress of seeing his mother's health deteriorate, along with the fear of further threats, nearly overwhelmed him. He didn't want to give up, but he also understood that the interests behind Richard's coma were powerful and would stop at nothing. And so, each of them found themselves caught in a web of pressure. Dr. Rivas, yielding to blackmail to protect his career. Sophia, torn between betraying her boss or preserving her own reputation. John, scared for his family's safety as anonymous threats piled up. At the center of it all was Richard Santamaria, more vulnerable than ever, fighting for recovery as external forces tried to keep him weak. The apparent calm in the hospital hallways proved as fragile as glass on the verge of shattering. After several days of subtle tensions and covert maneuvers, a new event completely upended Richard Santamaria's tenuous stability. That afternoon, Dr. Alvaro Rivas, overwhelmed by pressure to carry out under-the-table orders, committed, or rather was forced into, an accidental medication mistake. The machines monitoring Richard's vital signs began emitting an alarmed beep, a sure indication that his condition was suddenly deteriorating. John Johnson, who had just started his shift, ran into Richard's room upon hearing the piercing sound. Inside, he found Rivas fumbling with the equipment, panic spreading across his face. Richard, who up to that point had slowly been regaining some awareness and had been able to open his eyes now and then, was now breathing irregularly. His pale skin and the spasms coursing through his body signaled a severe relapse. "What happened?" John demanded, his voice trembling as he checked the IV lines and sedative levels. I'm not sure." "There was confusion with the dosage," the doctor stammered, trying to hide his shaking hands. Immediately, John realized something was off. Dr. Rivas was an experienced professional, meticulous in his work until these recent events. Administering the wrong medication or an overdose sounded implausible, unless it was deliberate or prompted by extreme stress. But there was no time to ask more questions. Richard was teetering between life and unconsciousness, and as a nurse, John had to act fast. Within minutes, an emergency team arrived to stabilize Richard. They administered antidotes, rechecked the IV lines, and monitored his heartbeat. Sophia Lemus, who happened to be at the hospital to deal with legal formalities regarding Richard's care, strode in with determination to find out what was happening. Seeing her boss on the verge of collapse, she realized this wasn't just a medical setback. Someone was pulling the strings to silence him for good. While Richard fought through his crisis, chaos swept over the Santamaria company. Henry Clinton had hastily called a shareholders' meeting, arguing that Richard's health was failing and that the company urgently needed strong leadership. In the past few days, Henry and Maria Fernanda had closed deals with foreign investors, setting the stage to formally remove Richard from the presidency. "This situation can't go on," Henry declared solemnly before the board. "Our president is neither mentally nor physically able to make decisions. We need a replacement to take charge of the company." Meanwhile, Maria Fernanda made sure the media heard her spin, leaking stories that Richard was suffering from severe cognitive impairment and that his return to leadership was practically out of the question. Several sensationalist tabloids repeated the story, while some newscasts speculated about a possible vegetative state. Before long, distorted images of Richard lying in his hospital bed were splashed across TV screens, fueling rumors that he would never run his businesses again. When Sophia learned of Henry and Maria Fernanda's public statements, she felt helpless. Though she suspected a conspiracy, she lacked definitive proof to halt their assault. Still, she decided to show up at the meeting to argue that Richard had not yet been legally declared incapacitated and that any motion to disqualify him required an impartial medical evaluation. But her words were met with an uncomfortable silence. Some executives preferred to keep their heads down, while others had vested interests in supporting Henry's rise. That night, John returned home with a knot in his stomach. Mrs. Rose looked frailer than ever, and Lucia greeted him with questioning eyes he couldn't answer. On top of everything else, threatening messages kept arriving, telling him not to get involved. Yet something within him had ignited when he saw Richard so vulnerable. The resentment he felt over his father's death did not justify turning a blind eye to such blatant injustice. That conviction made him recall something Richard had mumbled during one of his brief moments of lucidity. "There's a dossier, evidence, in my office." Intrigued and determined to help somehow, John discreetly searched the hospital records and Richard's personal belongings. He found nothing, until one night, as he sifted through the small nightstand in the patient's room, he discovered a key ring with a little pendant engraved with what looked like an address. Without overthinking it, John clung to the idea that the address on the key ring might lead him to a place where Richard kept important documents. He knew it was risky, and that playing detective was far beyond his job description, but he also sensed that Richard's life, and possibly his own, depended on uncovering the truth behind so much cover-up. That same week, using a random excuse, he managed to leave the hospital mid-afternoon and headed to a rental storage facility on the outskirts of the city. When the attendant asked for the key and checked the number, it turned out the unit was indeed registered to R. Santa Maria. With his heart pounding, John stepped into the storage room. Among dusty boxes and shelves filled with old folders, he found a small briefcase sealed shut. He forced the lock with the key on Richard's keyring and, to his surprise, discovered a dossier packed with papers listing names, dates, and banking transactions. Page after page linked Henry Clinton and Maria Fernanda to money transfers and questionable dealings with various international partners. It also mentioned the misappropriation of funds and plans to oust Richard from the presidency, all backed up by printed emails. John realized that in his hands was the proof that Sophia and Inspector Benitez needed to blow the lid off this conspiracy. However, he also knew that holding such evidence made him a bigger target than ever. With shaky hands, he tucked the dossier into a backpack and prepared to contact Benitez, the only police officer who genuinely seemed intent on getting to the bottom of the explosion and the ongoing plot. When John left the storage facility, he glanced both ways along the street, fearing he was being followed. His resolve never wavered. That very night, he called the inspector and arranged to meet in a public place, far from prying eyes. Benitez greeted him somberly, but as soon as he laid eyes on the documents, they lit up with the confirmation he'd long sought. There was no doubt now that the explosion in Richard's car hadn't been some random accident, but rather a planned attack by his own associates aiming to seize control of the business. "Mr. Johnson, this is pure gold," said Benitez, flipping through the dossier. "If these documents are real, we can take them to a judge and get warrants for Henry and Maria Fernanda's arrest." "They're authentic," John affirmed, though a shadow of fear crept into his voice. "But I need protection for my family. I've been getting threats." "We'll do everything we can to keep them safe," Benitez assured him with a curt nod. "Even so, we have to proceed carefully." Meanwhile, Sophia wrestled with what her next move should be. After Richard's relapse, she decided to put her faith in John, realizing that he was now the single stable link between her and her boss. When John showed her the dossier and explained how serious its contents were, Sophia felt both relieved and worried. These documents could save Richard and take down the conspirators, but they also endangered anyone who possessed them. That very evening, John and Sophia met alone in the hospital cafeteria, which was deserted at such a late hour. In hushed voices, they devised a plan to get Richard out of the facility and protect him from the pressures Dr. Rivas was facing. They agreed that if Richard stayed where he was, he might face yet another accidental relapse. He needed to be moved to a secure place or a private wing staffed by trustworthy professionals. "If Inspector Benitez backs us, maybe we can arrange the transfer without raising too many questions," Sophia said, nervously biting her lip. "All right," John agreed, "but we have to do it soon. Richard won't survive another round of medication tampering." With a blend of adrenaline and dread, they left the cafeteria fully aware that everything boiled down to a risky gamble. Time was running short, and if Henry managed to lock in his power within the company while keeping Richard weakened, there'd be no turning back. Their courage might be the only thing standing against such far-reaching influence, but the truth was on their side, along with their determination to save a man who, despite everything, still seemed to deserve a second chance. The discovery of the incriminating dossier implicating Henry Clinton and Maria Fernanda completely changed the course of the investigation. Until then, Inspector Benitez had been cornered by the lack of cooperative witnesses and pressure from above. Now he held in his hands a solid collection of documents pointing to the conspiracy behind the explosion of Richard Santamaria's car. The bank transfers, emails, and records of secret meetings all tied the two associates to suspicious transactions and shady contracts. Benitez spent hours examining every page, verifying each reference and cross-checking dates. The dossier not only suggested that the explosion was orchestrated, but also described how Henry and Maria Fernanda had manipulated several members of the board to pave their way to power. Once he finished reading, the inspector let out a long sigh, knowing he was dealing with a high-profile case that would make him a target of powerful people. "This proves it wasn't just an accident," he told John, who looked on anxiously. "With this, we can file for search warrants, seize accounts, and eventually make arrests. But I have to tread carefully. If they find out what we have, they might run or speed up their plans." John nodded in silence, feeling a glimmer of relief at the inspector's determination. But a new crisis erupted that same afternoon. Someone from home phoned him to say that Mrs. Rose, his mother, had suffered a severe respiratory episode. Her chronic pulmonary condition had taken a dangerous turn, and now, despite inhalers and medication, she was weak and on the verge of needing hospitalization. When John arrived, he was greeted by a harrowing sight. Lucia, only 8 years old, was sobbing at her grandmother's bedside, clutching her hand, while Mrs. Rose struggled for breath, doing everything she could to tamp down her relentless cough. Her face betrayed the effort it took just to stay conscious. "Mom, try to stay calm. We're taking you to the hospital," John urged, gently stroking her arm. "Son, I don't want to be a burden," Mrs. Rose murmured, nearly choking on her own frailty. "Stop talking like that. We're leaving right now," John insisted, firmly picking her up as Lucia watched through tear-filled eyes. All the way there, thoughts of the conspiracy and the contents of the dossier took a back seat in John's mind. The fear of losing his mother at such a crucial juncture overwhelmed him. He remembered the pain of watching his father die years ago, terrified of repeating that ordeal. For a moment, he wished he could forget the entire Santa Maria business and focus solely on his family. Yet he also knew he couldn't let the guilty go unpunished, especially with the ongoing threats looming over Lucia and Mrs. Rose as well. Once they reached the hospital, the diagnosis was no better. The physician in the ER recommended more aggressive and more expensive treatment to stabilize her pulmonary function. Money, yet again, stood in his way. John felt he was pressed from all sides. He needed the financial aid that Richard's company might provide, but at the same time, the magnate's associates were still pushing their conspiracy forward. With his mother admitted for observation, John got a call from Sophia Lemus. The attorney asked him to hurry back to the private hospital where Richard was staying. Working together with a trustworthy doctor, one who wouldn't be intimidated or bribed, they had managed to stabilize the magnate after his latest setback. Sophia believed the only way to fully dismantle the takeover was for Richard to show up personally at the upcoming shareholders' meeting, scheduled in just a few days. "He has to go, John," Sophia said urgently over the phone. "If Richard doesn't speak in front of the shareholders, Henry and Maria Fernanda will have him declared completely unfit to run the company, giving them final control. But Richard needs time to recover." "Will he even be able to get out of bed by then?" John asked, full of doubt. "Dr. Rivas has been hurting him, and he's still in a fragile state." "We'll do our best. The specialist I brought in has experience with trauma patients in critical condition. If everything goes according to plan, we'll have a couple of days to get him ready." John heard Sophia's unwavering resolve and realized there was no turning back. Either they acted now, or all their efforts to secure the dossier and risk so much would have been in vain. The date of the shareholders' meeting was fast approaching, and Henry was already orchestrating legal maneuvers to secure his takeover. Meanwhile, Maria Fernanda kept fueling media speculation about Richard's mental instability, shaping public opinion to see him as incapable of leading anything. The complexity of the situation only deepened. John now had to decide: stay by his mother's side in the public hospital and care for her recovery, or continue risking himself to hand over the evidence to the inspector and support Richard in his moment of need. Upon seeing how distressed he was, Lucia broke down in tears, throwing her arms around him. "Daddy, what's going to happen to Grandma?" she cried. "I'm scared she's going to die." "No, sweetie, nothing like that," he reassured her, gently hugging her back. "I'll do everything I can to help her." But once he hung up the call with Sophia, he realized that saving his mother would also require continuing to access the emergency assistance his job at Santa Maria's company could provide. That meant helping Richard regain his position, or at least showing that he was capable of protecting those under the corporate umbrella. Caught between these realities, John resolved not to give up. Even with Mrs. Rose gravely ill, he organized his schedule so he could watch over his mother, while also aiding Sophia as they prepared for the final showdown. He continued discreetly coordinating with Inspector Benitez, who was, in turn, getting ready to request arrest warrants for Henry and Maria Fernanda at the right moment. Sophia, for her part, pinned her hopes on Richard's slow improvement. Thanks to the new doctor who managed to slip into the clinic without drawing suspicion, the harmful sedatives and wrong doses that Dr. Rivas had been using were cut back. Little by little, the magnate began regaining enough strength to sit up and string longer sentences together. "I must attend that meeting," Richard mumbled during one of his first moments of clarity. "They can't take away what I worked so hard to build." "Steady now, Mr. Santa Maria," Sophia said, taking his hand. "Your health is our priority. But yes, we need you there, at least so the board and the shareholders can see you with their own eyes." "John," Richard called out, looking for the nurse, "thank you for being there. I promise, I'll repay you." The sincerity behind his gratitude moved John, who was torn by so many contradictions. He couldn't forget his own family's needs or his professional duty to save any patient in his care. That night, he returned to see Mrs. Rose and Lucia, all too aware that time was running out. With each new crisis his mother faced, every fresh threat, and each new PR maneuver from Henry and Maria Fernanda, the clock ticked mercilessly on. Finally, a date was set for the extraordinary shareholders' meeting, to be held in the main conference hall of the Santa Maria building in just a few days. At that meeting, the board would decide whether Richard would remain as president or whether the case could be made for his permanent removal. Henry and Maria Fernanda intensified their smear campaign, but Sophia and John were bent on revealing the truth, bolstered by the evidence Inspector Benitez was ready to deploy in a police intervention. As time raced against them, tension engulfed every corner of the hospital and the corporate offices. Mrs. Rose's condition remained critical, while Lucia whispered silent prayers for her grandmother's recovery. Sophia, exhausted but steadfast, arranged the final details for the big day, and Inspector Benitez waited for the right moment to act. The day of the extraordinary meeting arrived amid an atmosphere of unusual anticipation. The main boardroom of Santa Maria's corporate headquarters, perched on the top floor, was packed with shareholders, directors, and top-level employees. Downstairs, in the lobby and on the surrounding streets, members of the press, summoned by an official statement, milled about, waiting for word on the proceedings. A palpable tension filled the air, fueled by rumors that this meeting would irreversibly decide the company's fate. At the boardroom table sat Henry Clinton and Maria Fernanda, both sporting a sober attitude, yet radiating quiet confidence in their scheme. One by one, the shareholders took their seats at the long oak table, prepared to hear the arguments of the associate who aimed to seize full control. A low murmur rippled across the room as copies of the day's agenda were distributed, where the first item was precisely the possible permanent removal of Richard Santamaria on the grounds of incapacity. When the clock struck the hour for the session to begin, Henry rose to his feet, adopting a solemn demeanor meant to convey gravity and responsibility. With a near-theatrical gesture, Maria Fernanda yielded the floor to him, and he started speaking in a firm voice. "Dear shareholders, we are gathered here today to address a delicate matter. Our president and founder, Mr. Richard Santamaria, has suffered a series of health issues that have kept him incapacitated for weeks. This unfortunate situation has prevented him from carrying out his duties as director, creating an environment of instability in the company." The attendees fell silent. Henry took advantage of the moment to display some slides showing a supposed drop in performance and dire financial projections. He highlighted the catastrophic consequences of waiting any longer for Richard to recover, bluntly insisting that the president was unfit to resume leadership and that, for the company's good, stable leadership was required. Maria Fernanda nodded solemnly, turning the pages of a document that supposedly endorsed the statement. "I have consulted medical experts," Henry went on, "and they all agree our esteemed founder's health shows no short-term signs of improvement. Therefore, and I say this with all due respect, I propose that this board formalize a leadership transition. I am prepared to assume the position of interim president with the valuable collaboration of our public relations director, Ms. Maria Fernanda." At that, some of the shareholders exchanged skeptical looks, while others, fearful of losing their own benefits, offered muted applause. Yet there was a sense of unease in the air, as though many were unconvinced by Henry's version of events. Expectation mounted, for some wondered if Richard was still comatose or if there might be a last-minute surprise. That answer came almost immediately. Just as Henry began to read aloud the draft of the resolution granting him total control, a stir arose at the back of the room. The glass doors slid open, and to everyone's astonishment, Richard Santamaria appeared, accompanied by Sophia. Though he still looked pale and walked with the aid of a cane, he held his head high and his gaze steady, a striking contrast to the rumors Henry and Maria Fernanda had spread. A stunned hush fell over the room. The onlookers held their breath, trying to process that this man, believed to be near complete incapacitation, was here in person, openly challenging the claim that his recovery was impossible. Richard positioned himself at the head of the board table, with Sophia at his side holding documents and offering him physical support with each step. "Pardon the interruption," said Richard, his voice husky but resolute, "but I've been told that my alleged inability to run this company is under discussion. I've come to prove I'm still here, more lucid than some might wish." His presence alone knocked Henry off balance. He blanched and pressed his lips together, making a poor attempt to hide his surprise. Maria Fernanda reflexively brought a hand to her throat, struggling to keep her composure, while her eyes betrayed the surge of anxiety within. "Richard," Henry stammered, "it's wonderful to see you in better health, but—" "Enough hypocrisy," the president interrupted. "I'm not here to celebrate my good health. I'm here to show the evidence of what really happened the day of my so-called accident." Sophia took the floor and, moving with confidence, began distributing copies of a dossier among the shareholders. These were the same documents John Johnson had discovered in the storage unit and which Inspector Benitez had authenticated. Within those pages lay bank statements, emails, and records of secret meetings that exposed the conspiracy. In a clear voice, The attorney explained how Henry and Maria Fernanda had arranged financial deals with foreign investors to push Richard out. She also detailed how they had manipulated the media and pressured hospital staff to keep Richard heavily sedated. "Ladies and gentlemen," Sophia concluded, looking firmly at Henry and Maria Fernanda, "this dossier shows that the explosion of Mr. Santamaria's vehicle was no accident, but a planned attack by those who stood to benefit from taking over the presidency. Here you will find the names, the dates, and the transactions." A collective uproar swept the room, shouts and questions all at once. Some shareholders stood up, furious, while others rifled through the pages, unsure if they could believe what they saw. Henry attempted to raise his voice in defense. "This is all fabricated! You can't believe—" he began, but stopped short as a group of uniformed men entered the room. Inspector Benitez, flanked by several police officers, strode in briskly, holding a court order in his hand and showing it to all present. "Good morning. I'm Inspector Benitez," he declared. "We have received conclusive evidence implicating Mr. Henry Clinton and Ms. Maria Fernanda in conspiracy, attempted homicide, and embezzlement. We are here to carry out a legal warrant for their arrest." Upon seeing the officers, Maria Fernanda backed away, shaking her head. She tried to stammer an excuse, but her voice failed. Henry, on the other hand, reacted angrily, slamming the table and raging that it was all a framed setup to ruin him. Nevertheless, the officers already had their handcuffs ready. Confronted with the dossier's hard evidence and Richard's statement, there was no room left for denial. Within moments, both conspirators were in custody. A stunned silence took hold of the room. Nobody could believe how rapidly events had taken such a radical turn. The shareholders turned to Richard, struggling to grasp that the man they had all but written off had not only returned, but was dismantling, in real time, the conspiracy that threatened the company. Leaning on his cane, Richard took a deep breath to hide any sign of pain. The coma and subsequent relapse had left him weakened, but a fierce resolve shone in his eyes. "I've been away, but now I understand more than ever who can be trusted and who is capable of betrayal. I want to thank Ms. Sophia Lemus, our esteemed nurse John Johnson, who isn't here at this moment, but whose actions made all this possible, and Inspector Benitez for their bravery. Today, shareholders, this company steps away from the shadows in which some intended to bury it." A timid ripple of applause spread among the audience and soon turned into broader approval. Some board members wore expressions of relief. Others felt humiliated for having believed Henry's lies. Meanwhile, the news cameras, alerted by the commotion, captured the exact moment Henry and Maria Fernanda were escorted out, heads bowed in defeat. Sophia moved closer to Richard to help him stand firmly. Though the scandal wouldn't end here, there was still a long legal process ahead. The truth had surfaced, indisputably. Everyone watching had witnessed not only the downfall of two villains hungry for control, but also the courage of people who had risked everything to uphold justice. With those two culprits finally exposed, the tension that had mounted for weeks began to lift. Yet the challenge remained to restore stability to the company and cope with the media and financial consequences brought about by the attack and conspiracy. As for the personal lives of those involved, especially John and Sophia, everything would be forever changed, having crossed lines they never imagined they would. This resounding turn of events at the extraordinary meeting signaled the end of the lies and the start of a new era for Santamaria's enterprise. Henry and Maria Fernanda, hands bound, left the room amid murmurs from the press and the disbelieving stares of the shareholders who, at last, could plainly see the strings of treachery that had threatened their company. The outcome stood as a triumph of truth, yet it also revealed the challenges to come, healing wounds and rebuilding lost trust. Following the shocking arrest of Henry Clinton and Maria Fernanda during the extraordinary meeting, life at Santamaria's company launched into a profound rebuilding process. It was obvious that those two weren't the only ones behind the conspiracy. They'd had help, or at least the passive compliance, of people at various levels. And so, a series of internal investigations was set in motion to uncover just how deep the betrayal ran. Despite Richard Santamaria's decisive victory, there was still much to be done to restore the company's integrity. Over the initial weeks, backed by the dossier and collected testimonies, Inspector Benitez also launched an investigation into Dr. Alvaro Rivas. It was evident he had not acted alone in altering medication and causing Richard's relapse. Though Rivas tried to claim he'd been coerced, that he'd feared for his career and even his life, the evidence showed his professional culpability. Eventually, he was removed from his position and faced legal charges that forced him to appear before the authorities. In parallel, the hospital administration began an ethical overhaul, reviewing contracts, accounting, and protocols to prevent such a serious incident from recurring. Meanwhile, Sophia Lemus solidified her status as Richard's right hand. After exposing the conspiracy to the shareholders and steadfastly defending her boss, many in the company realized she represented the values Richard intended to reinforce: loyalty, honesty, and commitment. With Henry and Maria Fernanda gone, Sophia took the helm during the transition phase and became indispensable in guiding each department toward more transparent management. Far from using the opportunity to enrich herself or hog the spotlight, she threw her energy into implementing anti-corruption measures and strengthening codes of conduct, convinced that strong ethics were vital to heal the wounds the organization had suffered. On the home front, John Johnson's situation took a positive turn. Once the truth came out and Henry and Maria Fernanda's intentions were revealed, Richard felt a deep gratitude toward the nurse. Without John's bravery and without the dossier he had found and delivered to the inspector, the conspiracy would have continued in the shadows, endangering not only the magnate's life, but also that of the many employees relying on the company. Eager to settle this moral debt, Richard personally covered Mrs. Rose's medical expenses as she was still in fragile condition in the public hospital. For John, it was an immeasurable relief. No longer did he face the torment of being unable to afford the intensive treatments his mother needed. For the first time in months, he felt hope that Mrs. Rose could truly stabilize, free of the financial constraints that had weighed so heavily on him. It also allowed him to spend more time with his daughter, Lucia, who regained her peace of mind seeing her father less burdened and able to be present for everything from school meetings to simple walks in the park. As the days passed, Richard gradually recovered from the physical after-effects of his coma. Although he required rehabilitation to return to his normal routine, his iron will and resilient character helped every step of the way. One of his first actions upon resuming partial control of the company was to re-examine the pharmaceutical production and distribution divisions. Delving into documents from years earlier, he came across the litigation that had once cut off vital medications to many patients, including John's father. Though Richard hadn't been the only figure involved in that corporate dispute, he realized the company's legal strategies at the time had facilitated questionable decisions that ultimately cost lives, whether directly or indirectly. He then summoned John for an honest conversation, acknowledging the company's past responsibility and promising to overhaul internal policies so it would never happen again. The moment was deeply emotional, tearing down the last barrier of resentment, separating the nurse and the magnate. "I'm sorry, John," Richard said quietly, hand resting on his cane. "I can't change the past, but I can make sure the future is better for the people who count on us." "Thank you for saying that," John answered, struggling to hold back tears. "I've also learned that not everyone who makes bad decisions does so out of personal cruelty. Sometimes it's how the system works if it goes unchecked and loses its humanity." Their hug sealed a reconciliation that went beyond the workplace, a moment of relief for John, who had carried the weight of his father's death for years. Now he saw Richard as a man intent on righting past wrongs, rather than the distant corporate figure he had silently resented. In turn, Richard realized the real strength of his company lay in the honesty and humanity of its people. Meanwhile, Henry and Maria Fernanda faced legal battles in court. Both were charged with conspiracy, attempted homicide, and embezzlement, among other offenses. Though their lawyers tried to reduce the sentences, the overwhelming evidence presented by Sophia, along with Richard's direct testimony and investigations led by Benitez, gave them little chance of escaping punishment. On the day the verdict was handed down, a brief press statement confirmed that both would be serving prison time. Justice had finally caught up with them. The aftermath of that tumultuous chapter lingered for a while in the hospital corridors and the corporate offices. Nonetheless, a collective feeling of relief and renewed hope prevailed. With tighter ethical guidelines, closer supervision, and dedicated staff, the hospital reclaimed the prestige that had been tarnished for a time. Under Richard's steady leadership and Sophia's professional judgment, Santa Maria's company launched a deep organizational culture shift, emphasizing social responsibility and transparency in every project. As for John, he returned to his daily life with the satisfaction of having done the right thing. He continued working as a nurse, devoted to his vocation for caring for others. Only now he could do so free from crushing medical bills. With Mrs. Rose stabilized and Lucia more relaxed, his home was filled with the warmth he had long yearned for. Sometimes he remembered how much danger he had faced confronting powerful people, but he was glad he had stepped forward when it mattered most. Time went on, and Santa Maria's enterprise embarked on a new chapter, freed from the corruption that had once threatened it. Richard, determined never to forget his lessons, remained vigilant in ensuring that the values he and Sophia championed took root in every executive decision. Inspector Benitez wrapped up the case on an official level, satisfied to see justice prevail against political pressure and cover-ups. Thus, the circle finally closed. The magnate survived the attack and emerged more human than ever. The company regained its foundation, and John not only secured his mother's recovery, but also renewed his hope that second chances truly exist. With the truth exposed and the conspirators punished, it was clear that loyalty and honesty can flourish even in the harshest environments. And so, in the end, John went on changing dressings and caring for patients at the hospital with the same dedication as always, but now with a genuine smile and a strengthened resolve. He could hold his head high, knowing that, in his humility, his courage had been decisive. For ultimately, every life that is saved or improved depends not only on those holding high positions, but on ordinary individuals who, with honesty and bravery, can bring about real change. This story of John Johnson and Richard Santamaria highlights the power of empathy, integrity, and courage in overcoming social and economic barriers. Through John, a humble nurse, it is shown that true greatness lies in compassion and moral principles rather than wealth or status. Richard, for his part, embodies the complexity of power and the potential for personal redemption, even at one's most vulnerable. Their tale of conspiracy and blackmail reveals how the unbridled pursuit of power can corrupt institutions, yet also demonstrates that justice and truth can prevail. Sophia Lemus stands as a pillar of loyalty and professional ethics, proving that working together openly is essential to healing and rebuilding trust. Finally, the story celebrates our human ability to forgive, to seek justice, and to find hope amidst adversity, underscoring that human connections and integrity can transform lives and create a more just, compassionate future. Thank you for watching this emotional story all the way to the end. If you enjoyed it, don't forget to like, subscribe, and ring the notification bell so you won't miss our upcoming tales. See you next time.